All right, welcome everybody to another edition of our podcast. This one is sponsored by the American Backdoor Fund that some of you may have heard about, and it was started in response to the tariffs. And we have our resident macro expert slash one-time pirate himself here to discuss the tariff implications. Before we get into the boring stuff like tariffs, why don't you tell us about how you sailed around the world when you were younger?
Yeah, it seemed like a good idea at the time, so I decided to just take off and spent 4 years floating around in the ocean. And I missed a really good business opportunity. If I had postponed that trip until now, I could have done a little sort of venture on the
Yeah.
side with the backdoor fund. But hey, there's still time.
Although I do remember a story about you in the Panama Canal needing to restock up on supplies and getting caught by some
Yeah,
customs
certain
officials. Yeah.
certain supplies
Yeah.
are a little harder to move around than others, but it does turn out that there are ways that are less expensive than paying duty
Yeah.
to move said goods.
So what was it that you wanted in Panama?
Well, we filled up a back of a taxi with booze, which is the logical thing to do when you're in a free trade zone. But it turns out it's difficult to take that stuff out of the free trade zone unless you make friendly with the guards.
And you got the booze on board?
Yeah, for the bargain basement price of $20 for a whole trunk. So, I feel like we had.
The whole trunk, how long did that last you? Like how many of you were on the boat?
There were four of us at the time.
How
I say at the time because that dwindled to two pretty quickly.
Yeah, don't mess with Seth.
I think we probably had we got some really cheap whiskey, which did not go quickly. So I think like at that point it was like 3.5 years later when we got back, there was maybe one left.
Oh wow. Okay. So the last one.
It did last a while.
Yeah. The free trade zone. Incentives matter, huh? If you don't buy a truckload instead of just one bottle.
Turns out people like buying stuff that's cheap, and so that free trade zone really works the trick.
Yeah.
So, which is a little funny when you're talking about tariffs, right? Because on the surface, it seems crazy. It seems like why would you want to work more and consume less? Because that's effectively the argument we're making. It's like we want stuff to be more expensive so that there are more jobs that need working more. And to me, when I look at that on the surface, I go, oh my God, this sounds like a terrible idea.
You sound like a very blue-blooded libertarian.
That's fair. I like my cheap Nikes and I don't like working. And so, let's just optimize.
Which is why we're recording this podcast instead of working today. So that's
100%.
Yeah,
it's way
it's
more
a lot
fun.
easier.
Way more fun.
So, okay, talk to us about what tariffs mean from an economic standpoint. And yeah, you were trained in economics. Tell us all about that.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, economists, at least in the way I was trained, tend to twitch whenever you start to get sort of the government involved in who buys what or who works for what wage.
Why don't they like such things?
Well, the idea is that it distorts your incentives, right? Like, let's say I'm paying 75% in taxes of my income. I have a lot less incentive to show up and go to work, and a lot more incentive to record podcasts and go to the beach and, drink beer, do sort of things that are more fun than sitting behind my computer crunching numbers. Incentives get messed up. Trade is an area in particular where incentives are distorted by taxes, in this case tariffs, and the sort of demonstrable consequences of that distortion are more than they are in some other walks in life or other parts of the economy. Which is why a lot of economists, of course not everyone, but a lot of economists, including Richard Baldwin, have spoken on this. He was one of my professors in the PhD, really dislike tariffs. And a really sort of toy example would be, what if you had only Iceland and Greenland in the world and they produce widgets and gadgets, and Iceland can produce 6 widgets and 12 gadgets, and Greenland can produce 12 gadgets and 6 widgets or whatever. So there's some, advantage. Maybe it's natural resources, maybe it's education, maybe it's just cost of labor versus cost of capital. There's a lot of reasons why some countries would be more efficient in some areas and not others.
I think, a lot of people give the example of businesses like grocery stores or any other business. And I think it's easy for us to understand why businesses specialize, right? You have a pizza shop, you have a grocery store, you have a data science shop, and you don't expect them to to barter their services, and I don't want to be making my own pizza. They don't want to be doing their own data science. Exactly. That's why we trade. And it's similar with countries. There's specializations within countries, but we tend to not really think of it that way because we assume every country can do everything else, but that's not true at all. And nor do you have the interest or, like you said, the resources to do the thing that some other country wants to do.
Yeah, that's exactly the argument, is that like, why stop at a border when you talk about specialization, right? Like, we don't expect everyone in New York to grow their own vegetables because there's just not that much of it. It would not be very efficient. So why do we expect a country to also produce everything that it consumes?
And I think it's another important distinction, because you're thinking about this in terms of countries when you're talking about tariffs, but at the end of the day, these are businesses dealing with each other. So this is an American business doing trade with another business in Canada or Mexico or what else is out there. But at the end of the day, these are just businesses, right? You're talking about a pizza shop in New York, a grocery store in New York, or a auto parts manufacturer in Mexico.
Yeah. And for that reason, when we talk about tariffs, like in sort of academic economics, we often view it as a technology, because it's something that allows you to acquire a good for less than you could produce it. I'll take the example of making shoes. Say it takes someone in one country 12 hours to make a shoe and someone in another country 2 hours to make a shoe. Basically, what you get is a technology to make shoes, 6 times faster than you could. And so that technology allows you to consume more while spending less time working, assuming you have something to trade for it, assuming you have some advantage.
Yeah, I guess going back to your example, which I think is important to learn a little bit more about. We have Iceland and Greenland. One makes 6 widgets and 12 gadgets, and the other one does the opposite, because for whatever reason, one's better at making widgets, one's better at making gadgets. And then they can either consume what they have made themselves, in this case, either 6 widgets and 12 gadgets, or vice versa, or they can trade with each other, and then what happens?
And then they can specialize, right? So the country that's good at making gadgets makes gadgets. The country that's good at making widgets makes widgets. And then they can achieve outcomes that they would never be able to achieve on their own. So they could, just for example, because the math is easy, consume 12 of each, 12 gadgets. They could never reach that outcome if they did not trade. So it's a situation in which everyone is better off. And what's interesting is that, that's a toy example in which these countries have some sort of like even ability to trade, in that they both have an advantage, and the advantage happens to be the same, making 12, whatever it is, widgets or gadgets. But advantages from trade exist wherever there's a relative advantage within a country. Like, one of those countries could make, for example, 2 widgets and 4 gadgets, and the other country could make 12 widgets and 6 gadgets. And there's still an advantage from trade, in that, like, you can specialize in the thing you're relatively good at and reach an equilibrium where both countries are better off, in the sense they're both absolutely consuming more than they could independently, even though there's a sort of difference in efficiency, in that, like, one country is better at producing everything.
Yeah.
You still get to a win-win situation. For that reason, academic economists tend to be very pro-trade.
So let's talk a little bit about deficits. Deficits are a scary word.
Yeah.
People don't like a deficit. It sounds bad. Is a trade deficit bad? What does it mean?
Exactly. And that's a big argument that's been used in the current context of the United States right now, right? Is saying that, like, we have this trade deficit, we are consuming more than we produce, therefore we must be losing money. We must be like
losers.
Yeah. I think that's the one. And, like, someone's gonna have to pay for this in the end. Framework gets compared to, like, because it uses the word deficit, a federal budget deficit, I think, in which, like, we're consuming more today, and, like, our kids, or, like, us in the future, or our kids or whoever, are gonna have to consume less, because we sort of, like, oh, sorry guys, we ran up a big bill and now you got to pay.
That sounds fun for us, though.
Yeah, and that sort of framing works in the case of a budget deficit. It doesn't really work in the case of a trade deficit, because the balance of trade is not all of your income. We're only counting goods and services, which is only part of our income. And so it's like saying someone who is an investor shouldn't consume anything, because they're trading goods and services at zero. If you're just investing in the stock market and getting, like, whatever you are, dividends out of that, then you still have an income. It just doesn't happen to come from goods and services. Your income just comes from your investment.
That sounds like a more fun way to make
Totally more fun.
Except in this.
Well, yeah, it fluctuates a bit. But, it's nice, right? You're consuming more than you produce. Great. Life is good. That's effectively what the U.S. has been doing since about 1980, is we have been consuming more than we produce, and we're consuming more than we produce because the returns on sort of the money that foreign countries put in the U.S. work in our favor as opposed to the countries who invest here. That has a lot to do with the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency, right? And so abroad, people want to hold dollars. These dollars are useful for trade. And what happens is, those dollars will often get stored in a U.S. bank. And the U.S. bank maybe pays some interest on those dollars, but then they don't just leave them there. They turn around and invest them in something. And typically what they're investing those dollars in is more lucrative than the interest they're paying. So you have this financial income that is helping to sort of boost your net income as a country as a whole, right? And so that's actually sort of more what's been going on with this trade deficit, is we're not actually running up a deficit that like our kids are going to have to pay later. That is a little bit the case if you're just buying treasuries, right? And then using those treasuries to buy Nikes that are made in Vietnam or whatever. But there are other sources of income in the U.S. that help us fund this trade deficit, which mean that trade deficit is not like something we actually ever have to pay back. It's not a deficit in the same sense a budget deficit is a deficit.
Interesting. So to summarize it, the way I understand it is that because the dollar is a reserve currency, everyone in the world wants dollars to be able to buy stuff. And because they want dollars, they need to basically get access to those dollars. And when people
using the U.S. financial system.
Exactly. So when a foreigner interacts with the U.S. financial system and puts money into a bank, that bank might be paying them interest. And we know like how the interest that's going abroad, that's been a topic that's been discussed in the news.
Sure.
But your point is that, okay, yes, we're paying a lot of interest to other countries because they're storing their dollars here. But at the same time, those banks are lending out that money and getting even more interest because they're lending it on prices. We all know if System2 tries to borrow money from a bank, it's
paying a
lot more than vice versa. And so I think it's so that's interesting. And we're using that funny money that's just been generated through financial means, basically.
Like trust fund money,
Exactly. Trust fund money.
It's like ghosted.
Exactly. To then just like, sit on the couches, watch Netflix, and then
get those Samsung TVs.
Yeah, they arrive on our doorstep.
Yeah.
So pretty good deal.
It is. It's been a great deal for the U.S. And so all the sort of hue and cry around trade deficits is a little strange to me when viewed in that light because I don't want to work any more than that.
Yeah.
The argument for it is usually around jobs, right? And like shoe manufacturing doesn't really happen in the U.S. anymore, just to take an example. And why is that? Well, it's because someone abroad is capable of making shoes, or a company abroad is capable of making shoes for less than the guy in the U.S. is willing to accept. So, what happens is, yes, someone in the U.S. wants to make shoes, but they want to make shoes at $100 an hour, $50 an hour. I don't know. And the market doesn't support that. The way I would view that is like, the market doesn't support that because we have this technology, i.e. foreign producers, who are able to produce those shoes at a much lower rate. So to me, it's a little bit like the guy who wants to shoe a horse because that's his business. He's a blacksmith. And the automobile comes along and the horseshoe business just like bottoms out, right? This is not looking good. And so he says the government should step in here and protect my horseshoeing business. It's like, well, I have a technology that sort of made that a little bit irrelevant. The same thing is going on with trade today. And so, it would be nice if you could make shoes at $50 an hour, but like there are probably other industries that the U.S. is really good at. I mean, wages here are high because we are productive. That's why wages are high. Otherwise, we couldn't support wages like that, right? So there are other industries where if you want the government to get involved, maybe the government can get involved in helping people transition to industries where the wages are at a level they would choose to work for.
The beach half the time when we still have to pay them all this.
I know. You got to get those valuable skills.
Exactly. Because you're so productive.
100%.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What about this argument about from a military strategic standpoint, we might want to have domestic manufacturing, especially when it comes to weapon systems and intellectual property. And the fact that, I don't know, like Americans might not want to make shoes, but the factories that are required to make shoes are part of that development where over time you can make electronics and you get like much better manufacturing, which is what we've seen in China. And all of a sudden they're superior manufacturing everything, not just like your shoes, but it's also weapon systems and all these like high-tech electronic components. And if we wanted to catch up to that, it's going to be really hard. So maybe there's an argument to be made that the shoes are sort of necessary on the way to making much more sophisticated things.
I wouldn't say the shoes are necessary in this case because we've already developed technologies that are more advanced. But I absolutely am sympathetic to the argument that you don't want to import your cruise missiles from China and then decide that let's go nuke these guys. And, oh shoot, they stopped sending us all those missiles we wanted to shoot back at them. That's a little funny.
Luckily, there are always these weapons dealers that are just they're there to supply you. They have no political ideology. They're always helpful. Willing to lend a hand.
Very open-minded.
Very open-minded. They're real citizens.
Percent.
Yeah.
But the national security argument is an argument that this sort of dismissal of tariffs doesn't really work for, right? There are definitely industries where we would want to be able to produce domestically. Food is another example that people like to use. Makes sense. The case in which global supply chains completely shut down and we can no longer import food seems extreme. But I'm sympathetic to the idea that sure, we would want to be able to feed ourselves in the event that trade.
Yeah. Okay, so let's assume we want to do some of these things. We want to bring back manufacturing, especially in these very sensitive strategic areas. The question is, how do you do that? And in particular, I'm referring to how are we gonna get the money to invest in these factories, in these domestic manufacturers? And I think one misconception is around, the whole tariff thing has been called external revenue service, because it's the other country paying for it. But how does that work in practice? So if I'm System2 and I need to import my awesome data from abroad and I go to the customs officer because I just got a shipment, who pays that tax?
I mean, in this case, it's probably going to be our clients paying the tax because we get whacked with this tariff. And it's like, hey, guys, this got a lot more expensive. Here's the bill.
That's right. This is a phenomenal point because it's, we always love passing our costs down to our clients because it's other people's money is the one thing that we learn.
I don't feel that's yeah.
But the reality that is that the importer pays, right? It's not like your external supplier that all of a sudden pays this bill. Show up, you want to retrieve your goods from the port, and all of a sudden you have to be the one paying that bill. And yes, you can try to negotiate and pass off some of those costs to the other side, but the actual payment of it comes out of your pocket. You're the one that has to write that check to the
Sure, and inevitably this stuff is going to get passed on to the consumer. So what's going to be the net effect of tariffs on prices? Well, prices have to go up.
What is so mean? Why don't we just lower our?
It's very insensitive.
Yeah.
But I mean, often if you there's two reasons prices go up. One, maybe you just buy this stuff from abroad, right? And it's just more expensive because it's got that tariff whacked on there. And so your shoes from China now go up 104% in price. It's okay, well that's a bummer. What's the other option? The fact that we're not importing shoes from China in this case with 104% tariff doesn't mean that domestic production of shoes is going to get cheaper. It's not. And so the alternative is just buying stuff that's more expensive here. Prices go up again. You're also handing local industries sort of more monopoly power, right? I mean, that's the whole point. Yeah, it's nice when it's me, but it's not nice when other people have monopolies that I want to buy stuff from. That's what I like.
No good.
But otherwise, no, we don't give market power to these guys necessarily because not only, are they less efficient to begin with, but when they have more market power, they can also squeeze this price up a little more even because there's no competition. There's no one else who can make shoes. Shoes are a silly example, but the more you take away competition, the more prices are just going to go up due to both the fact that it's expensive to manufacture here and the fact that they have increased market power.
No.
So,
I think the whole price increase argument is really fascinating because inflation is bad. People don't like it. There are lots.
it's bad in excess. It's nice in moderation because you can't adjust someone's wages down. So the way you decrease wages is if you're a business, is just about the same. And, prices go up.
That's the heartless libertarian argument. That we can't pay you less, but we can pay less in real wages.
Real
nominal
and you
wages
won't notice
will
because
go
the
up.
number of zeros on your paycheck never changed.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it may have even gone up.
Yeah.
Yeah, real, fake, all these things are very hard to
very
understand. And it's, the other part of it, and we're very guilty of this at System2, which is a shameless plug, is that we work on pricing exercises. Because it turns out that investors in this very sophisticated economy that we have, clearly we've been living off of the profits of our investment businesses for a while. They demand that margins go up, EBITDA goes up, revenue goes up. And so every time private equity acquires, I know, every time they acquire a company, what they want to do is they want to raise prices and cut costs. And it turns out that makes shareholders extremely happy. That gets the stock price going. Everyone loves when the stock prices go up. And so it is something that a lot of very smart, hardworking people are trying very hard to figure out. How do you actually raise prices? Forget about whether you're in a tariffed economy or there's other macro shocks. This is any given Sunday. People are always thinking about, can I squeeze a little bit more margin out of my product?
Yeah, and the big question is there, to bring it back to tariffs, is like, what are the alternatives your consumer faces? And if you can identify those alternatives, then you can price efficiently from the company's point of view, maybe not from my point of view if I'm buying their stuff.
And then, okay, let's talk a little bit, going back to your smuggling days. This is the statute of limitations, I'm assuming, has passed.
Oh, yeah.
For that, we're good, right? Yeah. I'm fascinated by human ingenuity in light of any problem. So, yes, you assume that this stuff is going to be great. Okay, we're going to get all these other countries to pay our tax bills. Sounds amazing. And then you have people that are constantly trying to figure out a way around this. And we've seen this with suppliers of companies that we're working with, where anytime, to your point earlier, like whenever there's a relative mismatch in something, whether it's the cost of production or whatever the case might be, you can find like arbitrage opportunities. And so the supply chains are so complicated. And if you're charging one country 10% tariff, another country has 100% tariffs, people are going to find ways to reroute their goods through these lower tariff countries or establish like manufacturing operations in these countries. A lot of suppliers already do. And we're talking to somebody in the jewelry space that manufactures in Thailand, but they also have a factory in the Middle East. And now they're just like, okay, we're going to like shift production there so that we can take advantage of this 10% tariff as opposed to being hit by these much larger tariffs. And so, and layer on top of that AI, on top of these like extremely complicated supply chains, and you can get a bunch of these goods that are optimizing, whatever the right word is, the import duties.
Yeah. I mean, the takeaway there is just because you make a rule doesn't mean people are going to do what you want. It means that they're going to find ways to get around your stupid rule because they have other ideas, It's like, I went to high school. I know this. Like, sneak out, no problem. You can make a rule, I'll get around it.
Exactly.
So, yeah, there is an element of that, too. It just increases the sort of bureaucratic burden on the company. And it also, creates incentive to do things that are maybe a little in the gray area.
No, that's all in the clear. ChatGPT
just great.
it.
Yeah. Okay. ChatGPT says it's out.
Everything's fine. Yeah. Logistics. Another point I want to briefly touch on. What does it take and build? If you think about making an investment into something like that, there's a time component to it. It's not like I can just say, okay, great, we all agreed we're going to do this, and tomorrow all these American factories are up and running. So when you think about the from your P&L standpoint, how much money I'm going to have to allocate towards the construction of factories or domestic manufacturing in light of the fact that I now also have to potentially raise prices on my consumers. I have to figure out ways to optimize my supply chain. It's just like the business decisions get significantly harder, and the time horizons are very different. How I have to pay taxes today, my consumer price stuff is going to take a while to potentially get into the system, and to build an awesome cutting edge factory can take a decade. How do you think about the different technical components?
Yeah, that's tough. There's a lot of issues there, particularly when you're talking about like the sort of cutting edge technology stuff, that really like high end, whatever, like fabs, that sort of thing. One of the biggest issues there is it takes really talented people to do that, right? Like, and you can't just legislate that a bunch of people become talented. It takes time to educate people. And so one of the things the US has been really great at doing is importing talent. And so if we stop doing that to the degree we have been, like we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit. So there's that aspect of it. And then if you want to promote certain industries around like ideas of national security and that sort of thing, you can always subsidize them, I suppose.
It pains you to say that as a libertarian.
It does. It hurts me deep in my soul. But that would sort of be the lesser evil, lesser than simply just slapping tariffs on any of those imported goods, I think. And ideally, looking in the very long run, want to subsidize is stuff that has positive externalities, right? Because in that case, like as an economist, I can get behind it. Like, oh, there's spillover from this whatever we're subsidizing that impacts other industries in a positive way, impacts sort of life generally here in a positive way. So like it would make sense to sort of distort the market a little bit in that sense.
Like GPS or all these classic examples of the government spending money on it.
Just research institutions or education, like, getting people up to speed, training them in these fields. But yeah, GPS is a great example of this sort of investment by the state that had very positive spillovers. Now we're all completely dependent on it, and I can't navigate anywhere without Google Maps telling me where to go, right? But like, phenomenal what we're able to do now with that technology. I mean, cell phone technology too was originally coming out of like government research. I think it was into like background microwave radiation, and people doing this research figured out that they could use these microwaves to talk to each other on their little instruments to measure background radiation. So,
and then it also heats up your food.
yeah.
Oh my God.
Win.
Yeah.
Yeah, phenomenal. So that sort of research, like, yeah, can totally get behind that.
Great. All right. Well, this was amazing. We learned all about your life as a pirate. We learned about tariffs, economics. I guess your overall message is, stay in school, kids, so that you can help build the next great American factory.
You got it.
And then if anybody needs help optimizing their supply chains, they can reach out to us. That's what we're doing here, especially with our newly launched American Backdoor Fund.
Great.